Something that terrifies me is that literally any object could be used as a murder weapon. Like in today's case, when a man murdered his mistress with a toilet seat lid. Marvin Hill was a married man having an affair with a woman named Christina Eubanks, and during the middle of one of their rendezvous, she asked him if he could help her fix her broken toilet. So Marvin agrees, he's helping her fix this toilet, and as they do, they break out into a big argument, and Christina starts threatening to expose this affair. And Marvin could not let that happen. He knew he needed to silence Christina, and so with the toilet seat lid still in his hand, he could only think of one solution. He proceeded to beat Christina over the head with the toilet seat lid until she was no longer moving. But that was only the beginning of this ordeal. Marvin then grabbed a dog lead, tied it around her neck, and then dragged her body out to his car with it. He then drove Christina's body out to a creek and just ditched it there before driving back home to his family and pretending like nothing ever happened. New fear unlocked.
The crazy way that 3 prisoners escaped from Alcatraz. Frank Morris was convicted at 13 years old for substance possession and robbery. He was incredibly smart and had an IQ of 133. He had a history of prison escapes, so eventually was put into Alcatraz. Brothers Clarence and John Anglin were in prison for robbery. Again, they had a history of escaping, so they were put into Alcatraz. Alan West had been arrested a total of 20 times, so he got put there too. In 1961, the 4 were all in adjacent cells in Alcatraz and started planning an escape. A key part of the plan was escaping through ventilation ducts under their sinks. They had to widen these in order to fit through and used various items that they'd stole from the prison, such as spoons. They even managed to put together an electric drill made from a vacuum cleaner they stole from the prison. The prison conveniently had a happy hour where they would actually play musical instruments together. This provided the men with a perfect cover when they wouldn't be heard drilling. Through the ventilation ducts, there was a corridor. Down this corridor was a secret workshop where the men actually used to put together things to help with the escape, such as a raft. They stitched together 50 raincoats from inside the prison to create the raft. They also used a mechanics magazine, which interestingly had instructions of how to create a life jacket. Then they had to figure out how to escape, but make it look like they were still in the prison. They created paper mache heads and popped these in their bed to make it look like they were still in bed. They even used real hair from the barber shop to make them look more realistic. On June the 11th at 10:30 p.m, Frank and the 2 brothers climbed through the ventilation duct and out of the other side. Alan actually discovered he couldn't fit, and by the time he actually did get through, it was too late. He ended up going back to bed. By now, the other 3 had climbed onto the roof. They then had to climb down a 50-foot kitchen pipe and over 2 barbed wire fences. They made a makeshift foot pump and used this to blow up the raft when they were near the water. They were attempting to travel 2 miles to Angel Island, where they would finally be free. Next morning, the prison guards noticed the 3 men are missing and locked down the whole prison. No one really knows what happened to the escapees after this. Many think they may have drowned, as it was very cold water, and their raft was eventually found washed up on the shore. Most people feel like they did get to Angel Island though. The FBI actually got a letter from a man claiming to be John Anglin. The letter says he was the last living escapee and he was trying to bargain with them to get free cancer treatment. He said he would give himself up and do a prison sentence if he could have the treatment. For some reason, the FBI just never responded. The shocking case of the Philpotts. On the 11th of May 2012, 6 children were in bed asleep when a huge fire broke out of their home. As smoke roared through the building, Mairead Philpott, the children's mother, called the emergency services. Their dad, Mick Philpott, was reportedly making heroic attempts to try and save them. However, 5 children unfortunately died in the fire, and the eldest actually passed away in hospital later on. At first, this appeared to be a tragic accident, but the truth was soon revealed. The fire had been started intentionally with petrol underneath the letterbox. When word got out about who the children's father was, many people were already familiar with him. Mick Philpott was notorious for being outspoken and provocative and had appeared on The Jeremy Kyle Show. He claimed to have had 2 wives and seemed to be really proud of this. He also had a horrible history of abusive behaviour towards women. He had been convicted for attacking 2 women with a knife and headbutting a female colleague. A press conference was held about the tragedy that had unfolded. Reporters really expected at this point for the Philpotts to come out and appeal to anyone who had any information about the fire. What the Philpotts actually did was just kind of came out and started thanking people. They didn't ask for any help with any information about the case at all. The only thing Mick asked for is to be left alone. If this genuinely had nothing to do with the parents, you would think that they would come out and be desperate for more information. Neighbours from across the road actually went to the police and told them that they had seen Mick during the fire. He was outside pretending to cough, not actually going in trying to help rescue his children. Police were now suspicious enough to try and set a trap for the Philpotts. They kept them in a hotel room and actually bugged the room. The recording reveals Mick quizzing his wife about how convincing she'd been in her police interview. Locals had also spotted the couple in a pub doing karaoke, dancing and drinking shots. Incredibly strange behaviour for two people who just lost their children. It also came out that Mick was reportedly flirting with nurses at the hospital where his son was on a life support machine. The true story of what actually happened was all about Mick Philpott getting revenge on his ex. In early 2012, one of his wives had left him. She walked out with 5 of their children and Mick just could not take this rejection. He wanted to do something to get her back and wanted custody of his 5 children with her. He set the fire up to frame the ex to make it look like she'd done it. He wanted to be the heroic dad to save all his children and for his ex to go to prison for it. Mick got life in prison for this. Mariad got 17 years and is now released.
Here are 3 crimes solved by the internet. For years, the identity of a car crash victim found in Greensville County, Virginia remained anonymous. In 1995, 2 men were found to have ended up in a fatal car accident. Though one man was identified, no one could quite figure out the second man's identity. All authorities had to go off of was a tattoo on his arm, a note addressed to Jason, and 2 tickets to a Grateful Dead concert. Grateful Dead fans made a page dedicated to identifying the victim using the composite image of what he might have looked like. Sadly, for years, his identity remained unknown. That was until 2015, when a woman recognized the image as that of her missing son, Jason Callahan. The family had assumed Jason had run away after he left to follow concerts and didn't return. The results were later confirmed by DNA analysis, and Jason was finally able to be returned to his family. When Abraham Shakespeare won $17 million on a scratch ticket, he thought his problems would be solved for the rest of his life. Sadly, he would soon lose his life to the hands of Dee Dee Moore, a woman who claimed she wanted to help him with his finances. When Abraham's body was found buried in the backyard of a home purchased by Dee Dee, everyone instantly thought she was guilty. When a website began to discuss the case, Dee Dee anonymously logged in to defend herself, though she eventually admitted to the murder. What she didn't realize is that her IP address was being logged on every post she made. Members of the public were easily able to obtain her IP address and sent it to the authorities. Dee Dee Moore was soon arrested and is currently serving life in prison without the possibility of parole. Nadia Kajuji was just 18 years old when she sadly took her own life in 2008. Her friends and family were devastated but knew that she had been going through a difficult time. She was facing pressure from school but had also been through a miscarriage. Still, they wondered what they could have done to prevent such a tragedy from taking place. This tragedy would soon turn into something far more sinister when it was revealed that Nadia was not the only one to make the decision to end her life. An online counselor named Celia Bay stumbled upon a disturbing chat room when a member named Cami D offered to join a pact with her. In this pact, both of them would take their own lives. In reality, there was no Cami D, who described herself as a 31-year-old nurse. Cami was actually a man in his 50s named William Melcher Dinkle, a married father of 2. Online, William used anonymous profiles and aliases to encourage others to take their own lives, and he'd done this dozens of times. The amount of people he encouraged to do this, however, is unknown. He was sentenced to prison for 360 days, but after reviewing this case, the Minnesota Supreme Court reversed the decision. He served 178 days in jail and will now be on probation for 10 years.
We need to talk about Kevin. Not this Kevin. Well, that one too. But we need to talk about Kevin Spacey. Kevin Spacey has been accused of sexual assault by dozens of young men and women, one of which was just 14 years old at the time. Oh, and by the way, in 2019, 3 of his accusers died. Hours after Kevin Spacey tweeted a bizarre video saying he would kill his enemies with kindness, one of his accusers took his life at just 47 years old. 3 months before that, another one of his accusers passed away as well. Their cause of death and identity have been withheld from the public. He was just 1 month away from going to trial against Kevin Spacey, and because he died, the charges were dropped. In May of 2019, one of his first accusers was struck and killed by a car. 2 months later, an anonymous accuser dropped their lawsuit. Soon, Kevin Spacey will travel to the UK to face 4 counts of sexual assault and 1 count of causing a person to engage in penetrative sexual activity without consent. In October, he'll be going to court again. In that lawsuit, he's accused of doing all of these things to a 14-year-old boy.
What? Bitch, what? Bitch, what? Let's go to this shit be like Friday nights. This shit made me feel alive.
I feel like that's a good idea.
That's just not safe.
That is. I feel like this is not made for that. Like, I don't think that table was made for that.
It's time for Cookies and Crime. This is the story of Shasta Groney. Shasta lived in a neighborhood near Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, with her mom, Brenda Groney, her mom's boyfriend, Mark McKenzie, and her 2 older siblings, 13-year-old Slade and 9-year-old Dylan. She was 8 at the time. On May 15, 2005, Slade had been hired by a neighbor to mow the grass by his driveway earlier that day. The neighbor didn't have enough money to pay Slade, but promised him that he would stop by his house tomorrow to pay the money. When the neighbor arrived the next day to the Groney home, he found no one was there, but the dog was still inside barking incessantly, and the family cars were still parked in the driveway with doors opened. Out of suspicion, he called 911. The scene inside would change this small town forever. The bodies of Brenda, Slade, and Mark were found inside, bludgeoned to death. The 2 youngest kids, Dylan and Shasta, were missing. These horrible acts were done by Joseph Duncan, a serial killer and child harmer. Duncan, who had a lengthy criminal record and a warrant out for his arrest at the time, was stalking the family. He was particularly interested in Dylan and Shasta. On the night of May 16th, Shasta was woken up by her mother, who said someone was in the house. They went into the living room, where she saw Duncan wearing black gloves and holding a gun. He tied her mother's hands with nylon zip ties and did the same to her mother's fiance and her brother Slade. Then Shasta and Dylan were removed from the house. While she waited with her brother, she heard multiple thumping sounds coming from inside the home. She had no idea what was happening. Shasta and Dylan were taken to other locations where they were repeatedly assaulted and tortured for 6 weeks. Duncan eventually told her that he had beaten her family members to death with a hammer. Dylan would later be killed. Duncan insisted that Dylan's death was an accident. Apparently, when Duncan was digging for a beer in a plastic box, a shotgun that was also inside the box went off, hitting Dylan in the stomach. Shasta then saw Duncan finish Dylan off. Immediately after killing Dylan, Duncan started crying and told her that he only killed him to put him out of his misery. Shasta also reported that Duncan nearly killed her days after killing Dylan. He gave her the choice to be killed either by strangulation or with a gun. Shasta chose strangulation, and Duncan proceeded to wrap a rope around her neck and pull it tight. However, Shasta begged Duncan to stop, and he immediately did. He then asked her if she would like to meet his mother, which she responded yes. The 2 drove back towards Coeur d'Alene and stopped at Denny's. At this point, an Amber Alert was already rung out, and authorities were trying to find the missing children. On July 2, 2005, 48 days after the case began, Duncan and Shasta were discovered at that Denny's. One of the men recognized Shasta from a billboard that he passed earlier that evening and alerted his girlfriend and several employees. 2 days after Shasta's rescues, officials announced that Dylan's remains were found off of a remote Forest Service road in the Bitterroot Mountains. Duncan's arrest for this horrendous crime also linked him to other unsolved murders. Shasta was the sole survivor in her family, and Duncan died in prison last year from brain cancer.